Chefs Without Restaurants, episode 97 with Daniel Gritzer from Serious Eats, part 2 of our conversation.
I have a recipe for Romesco sauce. And for years cooking in New York City and seeing recipes here, it's roasted red bell peppers, roasted red bell peppers, roasted red bell peppers. And you just, if you don't stop to dig into it, one may just assume that Romesco sauce is in part based on roasted red bell peppers. And it's not roasted red bell peppers. Not that there's nothing wrong with using roasted red bell peppers. It's an entirely rational choice when you cannot get the peppers that are more commonly used in Spain. It's an entirely different pepper. It's not a bell pepper. It's not a fresh pepper. It's a dried pepper. It's not roasted. You get that complex flavor from the fact that it's a dried pepper. The point isn't that you have to use the Ñora pepper, but it's helpful to know that, isn't it?
This is the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast with your host, Chris Spear. Each week, I'll be speaking with food entrepreneurs and people in the culinary industry. If you're interested in learning more about our organization dedicated to helping people build and grow their food businesses, look us up on the web at chefswithoutrestaurants.com and .org, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Chefs Without Restaurants. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. I'm your host, Chris Spear. On the show, I have conversations with culinary entrepreneurs and people in the food and beverage industry who took a different route. They're caterers, research chefs, personal chefs, cookbook authors, food truckers, farmers, cottage bakers, and all sorts of culinary renegades. I myself fall into the personal chef category as I started my own personal chef business, Perfect Little Bites, 11 years ago. And while I started working in kitchens in the early 90s, I've literally never worked in a restaurant unless you count Burger King or Boston Market. This week, I have part 2 of my conversation with Daniel Gritzer, culinary director at SeriousEats.com. I've been a big fan of both Serious Eats and the Food Lab for a while and was really excited to talk to Daniel about his work there. We had a long discussion, so I broke our conversation into 2 parts. Part 1 aired last week and is linked in the show notes. On this episode, we discuss scaling recipes, cooking on a boat, the original pepper used in Romesco sauce, atoles, and being thoughtful when developing recipes. We also tackle the controversial topic of Maryland crab cakes and Old Bay. Where do you stand on the topic? And a reminder that you can help support our podcast and the Chefs Without Restaurants network by donating through our Patreon. Monthly support starts at just $5 a month. Go to patreon.com/Chefs Without Restaurants to find exclusive recipes and see our tiered rewards. And now, on with the show. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.
I don't feel good about this. I don't think this is a good way to go about this. Let's not play this game anymore.
Do you have any recipes that are notoriously hotly debated? Is there something you can remember where you posted a recipe and people were like, not that it didn't work, and maybe it's not a recipe. It's like when someone posts how to clean cast iron. That's one of those things that always is a hot topic. Do you have a lot of those in the comment section or on Twitter where people I can't believe that's how you would make this? Can you think of anything?
Oh yeah, it happens a lot. It happens actually. Maryland, you're Maryland.
Yeah.
So my mom grew up on the Eastern Shore. I grew up in Brooklyn, so I can't lay any direct claim to to a kind of Maryland life, but I definitely got it from my mom. Growing up, eating crabs, the value of a human in my family was directly connected to how well and quickly they could clean a crab. And I did a crab cake recipe, Maryland crab cake recipe. And one of my prized cookbooks in my quite large cookbook collection is this little community cookbook from Galena, Maryland, from the 60s or something, that obviously, among other things, has crab cake recipes in it. And so when I was doing research on my Maryland crab cake recipe, that was certainly one of the places I looked. And you brought this up already, Old Bay. These old recipes didn't have Old Bay in them. And of course, I was aware. I love Old Bay. I have nothing against Old Bay. But I ended up going down the road of doing my own spicing based, more along the lines of kind of what I was seeing in these old recipes, and not just using Old Bay to sort of add all of that flavor to the crab cake. And it set off like all sorts of arguments in the comments, because there were people coming in going, I'm from Maryland and this recipe is BS. There's no Old Bay. It's not a Maryland crab cake, period. The end, case closed. And I was like, well, that's funny, because I've based this recipe on like research that is really clearly showing that in your very state, in kind of in the heart, one of the hearts. I don't know what the heart of Maryland is, but like the Eastern Shore is certainly like a culture, an important cultural part of Maryland. There's no Old Bay. Just going back, what is it, 50 years, 60 years?
Yeah, I don't know when Old Bay was started.
Yeah. So, and it seemed to. I never fully explored this after, but it seemed to kind of emerge that there was two things. There was like, when did Old Bay really become a dominant brand in Maryland? And also regional, that there were possibly regional variations where in some parts of Maryland, like in the Baltimore area, like if you didn't put Old Bay, like, yeah, starting at some point in time, you were not doing it right. But in other parts of Maryland, that wasn't necessarily the case. And, I think probably Old Bay slowly has sort of spread its dominion on the crab cake realm. But that one was really fascinating to me, because I was like, I've got some pretty good primary texts here to counter this emphatic argument that I have, this Yankee has swooped in and completely disrespected the crab cake. So that's one example. It happens a lot.
Well, crab cakes still go. I mean, it's like, is it deep fried? Is it pan fried? Is it broiled in the oven? Is there any kind of, like, people say, like, I don't put any filler. It's like, there needs to be some kind of breading in there. Like for me, even if it's just like a scant amount, like something to hold it together. It is just too wet if you don't. Right. But people argue me. So mine has Old Bay in it. I use panko, which, none of your recipes would have, because nobody used panko in the 60s or whatever. I just find it tedious to cut white bread. All the old recipes are like, take white bread, cut the crust off, cut it in small little things. But
my recipe is panko also.
Really?
Yeah, I wasn't just recreating those recipes, but I was using them as a touchstone. So when I saw those old recipes and they didn't have Old Bay, I was like, well, this is a sign to me that I can do a real Maryland crab cake, something that's honoring, is respectful to the tradition without Old Bay. Like, Old Bay doesn't have to be in one. If you want to put it, that's awesome. Like, it's delicious, yeah. But you don't have to. That is not in and of itself an offensive move. And then for the exact reason you're articulating, I grabbed the panko, because it's like, well, what do we probably want? Some kind of white bread. What is panko? It's really fluffy dried white bread. It's like, it's awesome filler. Like, why would they use panko?
Well, and it's easier when you're doing big batch. So one of my claims to fame, or whatever, I guess not fame because nobody knows about it, I worked for Sodexo, huge contract food service company. I developed their Maryland crab cake recipe, which is used globally. So like if you were at a business dining account in Tokyo and they were using the recipes, which, all accounts are supposed to uses that, and one of the things is, you have large accounts. I worked at a place where we had, 750 people there eating all the time. We can't be cutting bread to toss in. It's like my cooks need to use like a 5-pound bag of panko or something. We're mixing it in this big thing. But, this was my only glimpse into test kitchen life, which I'm sure is your life all the time. But I was working at an operation, but they sent me down to Gaithersburg, where their North American headquarters is. And I went to the test kitchen for a week. And I didn't realize I would spend 5 days working on like 3 recipes, right? Like, we're going to make the crab cakes. We're going to take volume measures of everything. We're going to take weight measures. We're going to make the crab cakes at 350, 375, 400. We're going to scoop them in 3 ounce, 4 ounce, 5 ounce. Okay. We like it when you use 1 pound, but when we scale it up to like 20 pounds, like, does the Old Bay blow it out? And we need to like reduce it down. It was fun, but I can't imagine doing that every day. It was super interesting, but yeah, I was given the job of creating the Maryland crab cake recipe, which they have in their database. So
that is really cool. It is really these kinds of things, the scaling thing that you're talking about. is really an interesting one. Like some recipes you could scale infinitely, right? Like, and they'll just keep working. They'll just keep working. Like
a lot of them don't. And that's the thing with contract food is like you're scaling to the umpteenth level. Like anytime you're getting into cooking for a hospital, a business, a retirement community, like you're making hundreds of things. It's not like home or even a restaurant where we're doing, 40 covers tonight. When if you're doing big catering events, like when you're making 400 crab cakes, like the scaling might be off. When you're making, soup for 600 people, up, like that might not, Cooks would come and say, like, this calls for 2.5 cups of cloves. Is that right? It's like, no. Like, no. Like, but if you had like half a teaspoon of cloves in something, then the scaling is going to tell you that it's like 2.5 cups. And it's like, I just don't feel like that's going to be a good thing. Like, let's start slowly and get there, get closer. And that's another thing that like you have to teach people when they're doing high volume cooking.
Yeah, some of those things I can't even imagine. I mean, with what I do, I don't deal with recipes getting multiplied to that level, which is really like a fascinating window into how wonky stuff can get if you scale that much. So you see it on even smaller levels. Websites, food websites, you're often talking about like, what would be cool functionality? Like, if we could just have a wish list and, unlimited time and resources will be cool. And one that comes up a lot is like, would it be nice if you could just scale, like you could just, the user could just enter in the number of servings and the recipe would like automatically scale. And I'm always like, don't do that. Please don't do that. Because if you build the tool, it implies to the user that it works. But with most of my recipes, I would be very uncomfortable even suggesting that works.
But that's how all this software works. Like the software we had a food, it was called food management, and the recipe database was there. And every time you just changed the number of servings, it scaled it. But we had to train all of our chefs really well to look at that and see. But a lot of that's why they're trying to do it in the test kitchen and kind of err on the side of lighter on some things that they know would blow out. Like some things are going to be fine, like the onions are going to be fine. And I bring up cloves because think of how powerful they are.
Yeah, cloves make things nasty
real
fast.
It takes some intuitiveness to it. There's a lot of things that we've done that I'm like, the scaling is not right on that.
Is the idea that they get it to work up to a certain sort of number of multiples, and then it's like, look, if you're going to take this serving for 20 and make it servings for 400, like whoever's on site needs to understand that they may need to make some on the fly decisions to sort of not do anything stupid. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And the software ties into like ordering and everything. So it's this whole thing that like now I take this recipe and it's going to be for 30 people. It's been costed out at the home office level. So we know that, this is how much it costs. So then it gives you like a shopping list. So when you're ordering from Cisco or whoever, so now I'm making 500 portions of lasagna and I know that you're going to need like 2 cases of ground beef and you're going to need this and that. And it's scaled that recipe out from a 20 cut lasagna to like 5 pans of 20 cut lasagna. But you have your grocery list for Cisco saying you need to order 2 cases of ground beef. It's really 1.5, but you're going to need 2 cases, right? So you do your whole week's worth of ordering within that system, and then it adds it all together. And then it kind of gives you your shopping list of everything you need to buy all in one shot, kind of adding it together across the board. Wow. Yeah. Wow. So that's like a whole different level of cooking. And that's where I've spent a good deal of my career is like high volume cooking.
Yeah, that is a whole, long time ago, I did some catering type work, which is high volume, but not anything on that level, of having stuff figured out like that. It's also, you said before, so much of what you do, you're in different people's kitchens all the time. And that's got to be...
You plan for worst case scenario, let me tell you.
Because you come with your knives.
I bring every bit of cooking equipment except a stove and an oven. So, that is the variable there. The question I ask is really, how many ovens do you have? Like, I have one oven at my house at home. So many people, especially as you move up in like wealth and class, people these days have 2 ovens, which is which is nice. And that's where it gets challenging for bigger parties. Like a party for 6 or 8 is fine, but I do, dinners for 12 to 15. And like if everything's in the oven, it's like, well, you need to have 2 ovens. And if you don't, then we can't have roasted ribeye and roasted potatoes and roasted Brussels sprouts. Like you've got 2 racks in there, right? We're going to have to do something on the stove or in a pressure cooker. But if you've got 2 ovens, then we can do that. But for everything else, I bring every pot, pan, utensil I need. I even have portable convection ovens I can bring with me. I have portable induction burners. I don't usually need them. But you still get into these weird scenarios with counter space and just, they've got a coil old stove with the coil burners or glass top.
That's brutal.
But it's
do they send you like a photo of their space?
A lot of chefs ask for that, and that might be something I do. I haven't had any issues with that. I guess you don't institute new protocols until you have an issue too many times, right?
At this point, you've probably you've done
I've seen it all.
Times. Yeah, there's probably very little you would walk into where you weren't like
a boat. Someone asked me to cater on a boat. They were doing like a sunset cruise on the Potomac, and I thought boat, like yacht or something. And they said, yeah, there's a grill there you can use, and you can bring a portable oven if you need it. And I got there, the grill was like the size of a 10-inch dinner plate, like round, right? And I had to cook everything on this. So I bring the oven, and the captain of the boat is like, no, like that's going to blow the generator. Like you can't bring this on the boat. So you have the grill. So I see the grill, and it has like a propane tank, like the mini, little one that I use for my blowtorch. And I have to cook like scallops. I have to do like ribeye steaks. They want mashed potatoes. Thank God I made them ahead of time. But I'm like reheating mashed potatoes in a frying pan on the grill.
And where are you holding everything while you got this one little grill?
I'm just wrapping everything in foil. And there wasn't even a work surface. Like when I got there was a table in the galley area, but they took the table out to eat. So I was able to prep on it. But once the first course came, they carried that out. And I was on my knees using like the bench as my, like I've got to cut. So I'm on my knees using my cutting board. And then the captain comes out. He's like, you can't have that on there. You're going to like ruin the upholstery. I'm like, what the fuck do you want me to do? Like, I was just like over it. And I said, never again. And the customer loved it, and it went off without a hitch. And now I get calls all the time. Like, my friend is renting a boat to do a cruise on the Potomac. I'm like, I can't. Like, unless it's like the, mansion yachts and there's like a full kitchen, I just can't do it. So I've kind of seen it all at that point.
That really is seeing it all. I mean, that's about as scrappy as you can get in terms of figuring out how luxury, yeah, but scrappy.
It's kitchen impossible. Yeah, but I had never had. I mean, beautiful. Who doesn't want to have like a beautiful sunset cruise out on the Potomac? Like he stopped right in front of the Lincoln Memorial at sunset. These people brought a professional photographer with them to do a photo shoot. And I'm just kind of like chilling, it's not a bad life, right? Like previously I had an office that overlooked a dumpster. And now, like even I'm a little stressed. They offer me a glass of champagne and I can have some champagne and, hang out on the water. Like life's pretty good,
Yeah.
As long as you can pull it off.
I know I haven't been in restaurants for a long time, but I know that as stressful as those moments are, that's also like, in some ways, those kinds of challenges are the things that you feed off of the most in this line of work. Where it's
most definitely.
It's like, yeah.
Especially once you're done with it. Like when you're sitting in the car,
you're like, that was cool.
You're sitting in the car and you're like, oh, the endorphins the adrenaline starts to wear off, and you're just like, like I'll never do it again, but it was fun.
Yeah,
it's
I don't want this to be like my every gig, but like that was, it's a story, and I survived. I used to work the pasta station at this Italian restaurant, and pasta service in an Italian restaurant at lunch is brutal. Like that's like every table, every chair is ordering pasta. Like you are the show, and it's compressed into a like 2-hour window. Like dinners can be marathons and they can be rough, but like usually they're more, a little bit more spread out. So it's a little bit more of an endurance game. Whereas like lunch was just like, it all just came. It was a tsunami. It was like a tidal wave. It all just comes at once. and it's all pasta. And when I first started, it was, horrible. It was just like every day it was painful. And I remember just getting to the point where like you get so good at it that you feel like you're in the Matrix, right? You're like, time doesn't exist for me. I see everything. Like, the world is not photons. The world is like, quarks, like
You're
whatever.
in that zone. Yeah.
You are in that zone. You're just like, you can't possibly. And then you start to wish for more. You're like, give me the worst thing ever, because that's what I want to do today. Because I want something that tests. It's a lame analogy, but if you're Neo in the Matrix and you're like, once you realize that the whole world is just like, you can see the zeros and ones, then you're like, I don't want to just like deal with this one bullet flying at me. Like, bring every army in the world. Like, I want to see what I can do with this skill. And that's a cool feeling. Like, it's when you get, that kind of moment of just sort of being at your most polished. And, for like you, like just like every time you walk into a new client's place, it's like, what's it going to be this time? Like, this is unknown every time. There's just got to be
It's a mixed bag. You know what I'll say? My very favorite parties are bachelorette parties because they're fun. They're easygoing. There's a lot of young girls who want really good food, like they know good food. They also pay the best. I think millennials get a bad rap, but millennials are also spending money like they're going to die tomorrow, which isn't the worst thing. Like, I think they value experiences and recognize that. Like, I'm more likely to get a 25 to 30% tip from them and get stiffed by like a Gen Xer or even a baby boomer, and they're just casual. And it's just like, there's no stress. Like, I come in, it's like, oh, we're having Negronis. Do you want a Negroni? And then it's like, serve food whenever we're going out to the pool. And then you just like put up some cool food. And like, for me, it's just like, I love it. I have a question. We jumped right in the conversation. How did you end up working at Serious Eats?
I was an editor at Food and Wine. And my food career started in restaurants. And then I got a job at Time Out New York. And that was not, Time Out New York was all about going out. So it was restaurants and bars. And it was a great place to learn the, reporting, fact checking, sort of basic journalistic practices that are a part of, even food writing. And then I went to Food and Wine. And so I was a food editor there. And so a lot of, I wasn't in the test kitchen as a test kitchen cook, but I was a recipe editor. And I had a like monthly column that was sort of like the food nerds column. And that, my thing was, I was always nerding out over everything. And my colleagues I really had a great time there. They were always saying like, Daniel, like, you've done enough research to write, a book on this, and you only have 3 pages. You don't need to go that far down the rabbit hole. And so at a certain point, so actually a former Food and Wine colleague of mine who had left tipped me off that he'd seen Kenji posting that he was looking for someone to join him at Serious Eats and expand the recipe program there. And, I had been a big fan of the site already. And so I was like, well, that is a place where I can go down the rabbit hole over and over and over again. And so, yeah, that's how I ended up at Serious Eats.
And I always ask people, like, what are their favorite culinary resources? And while I've said your website's mine, what are some of your go-tos? Do you have favorite websites, cookbooks, or just places for inspiration?
I'm very proud of my cookbook collection. And the cookbooks I love the most are the ones that I've like either picked up while traveling and brought back in my luggage, or that I've ordered, some kind of rare book that I found online, or an old book or something like that, or like the Maryland, Galena, Maryland community cookbook, these special ones they're full of wonderful information that I turn to like again and again and again, and that are, not as common. Not that the rarity of them is what makes them special, but just, I think it is very easy, particularly with the internet, in a strange way, that the internet kind of in some ways, like it's lived up to its promise and it's also betrayed its promise, which is that everything is on it, but you tend to, the forces that be, you tend to find the same things over and over and over again. And it can feed this sort of echo chamber. You run a search and you get the results you get. And, usually we're pretty happy with those results. Like it's mostly kind of doing, and, most of the searches I run, the answers I get, I'm satisfied. So it's working for me. But it's also like, if you stop and think about it, it's like, what am I not finding? I have tricks when I'm doing searches on the internet for recipes to get outside of at least like the American search results, not secret tricks, just, things to like force, I want to see the recipes for this thing in Italian. Obviously the powers that be on the internet think based on where my IP address is and some other, things that they're going to know about me, that I'm looking for English language sources, but I need to get outside of that. I want to, let's push beyond that. So the internet's funny in that way. So I love those, all of these cookbooks in my collection. They just feel like when you're doing something like a crab cake and somebody says it's not a real crab cake if it doesn't have Old Bay, I have the resources to say, I respect your opinion about wanting Old Bay in your crab cake, but you're wrong about saying that it has to be in it. And I can prove, I've got something to prove this. So I love all of my cookbooks like that. And I think for online, it's case by case for me. I don't have a go-to. There are competitors, in the sort of food media space that I have lots of respect for and think they do cool work. But if I'm doing recipe research, I'm often interested to see what some of the obvious sites have. But I'm even more interested to see the not obvious stuff. And, in particular, like getting my eyes on either the printed digital recipes of, I did air quotes there, printed digital recipes online or videos. And, that's the video stuff is awesome for recipe research. It's super helpful to watch people, particularly if you're doing a recipe that's like a cuisine based in the country of origin, making it. Not that that's the final word on it, but like that's way more informative than, and it's crazy because then you see where the echo chamber, the kind of the evidence of the echo chamber becomes more obvious, because you can read 6 English language recipes and articles about a dish, and they all are kind of different versions of each other. The similarities are striking, or there'll be something in the technique that's the same. They're not plagiarized, but like you can tell they've looked at each other, or one of them's looked at the other one. Like there's these patterns are being repeated in the recipe creation, and then you get outside of that, and you see like, whatever let's use Italy's example, like someone in Italy making this thing just doesn't do that thing at all, right? And it's just like, oh, that's wild. Like that's completely, it's not wrong, but it's just like pushing through. And, and there's a lot of obviously like criticism of like the idea of authenticity. And I think that it's very important to be careful about, how we frame this stuff, but it's so helpful to be able to look at a recipe from its source, or from someone who's a better representative of the source, and see what they're doing. And that's really, I really love that. I have so much fun doing it. And you can, I don't speak most of the languages of the world, right? Like you can do all sorts of great stuff with translation tools.
Google Translate is amazing. Like the amount of websites that all just copy and paste the text into my browser and translate.
Yeah, you can say like, I want to do this recipe, or I'm researching this recipe. I have an interest in this recipe. If I search for it under its let's use like a Thai green curry. And I type Thai green curry recipe. Well, I'm definitely getting, English language, probably US based for the most part, results. Combination of where Google is going to know I am and where, the language I'm using to search. And let's say, okay, I don't want to do that. So I'm going to take a lot of times you get the transliteration of the Thai, right? Now, I don't know off the top of my head what the words are for Thai green curry in Thai, but it'll be transliterated and it will be spelled using still the Roman alphabet. If you search that, it will still probably kind of force you back to the American results. Well, if you take that transliteration or, Thai green curry, even just in English, and you run it through Google Translate into Thai, and I can't read Thai, but I can copy and paste the result in the Thai alphabet, then it's really saying to Google, like, quit it with these American recipes for Thai green curry. I want to see the Thai versions of this that are on the internet and videos. And I love doing stuff like that to inform and enrich what I'm looking for. So, I don't have to, I wish I could speak every language. That would be great if I had the time to learn. But even without that, to be able to sort of use these little tricks to get outside of the box that we kind of keep getting put back into through the AI.
Yeah, it's going to bump us over to Food and Wine and allrecipes.com. And maybe if Serious Eats has a Thai green curry recipe, but that's what's going to show up on the top of my feed for sure.
Exactly. And I want to look at those. But for a lot of stuff, if it's like a specific cuisine, I want to get outside of those too. I did, I have a recipe for Romesco sauce. And for years, and cooking in New York City and seeing recipes here, it's roasted red bell peppers, roasted red bell peppers, roasted red bell peppers. And you just, if you don't stop to dig into it, one may just assume that Romesco sauce is in part based on roasted red bell peppers. And it's not roasted red bell peppers. Not that there's nothing wrong with using roasted red bell peppers. It's an entirely rational choice when you cannot get the peppers that are more commonly used in Spain. It's an entirely different pepper. It's not a bell pepper. It's not a fresh pepper. It's a dried pepper. It's not roasted. You get that complex flavor from the fact that it's a dried pepper. So it's like stuff like that.
I've never heard that in my life, and I make Romesco all the time. That's amazing. Yeah,
you check out my recipe. And the point isn't that you have to. The point isn't that you have to use the Ñora pepper, one of the main ones that would be used in Spain for Romesco. But it's helpful to know that, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Like, because I'm sure it's just because it's hard to get, so that's been the easiest way to do it, and over time that's become the de facto way that we make it.
Exactly, and that's like the echo chamber I'm talking about. Like,
yeah.
Then we all just are like repeating this pattern that we've observed, but it's like, who informed this pattern? It's not wrong. It's not bad. There's nothing, but it's like, how did this come to be? And is there more to this story? So I really like that kind of stuff, and then the thing is, okay, I get it. Like in the 1980s or 70s or 60s or whenever, like, food media was first publishing Romesco recipes, in the United States. I totally get the move to figure out what's a smart substitution here. Now, you can't get Ñora peppers, but you can take a red bell pepper, you can roast it, you get this complex charred flavor. It's delicious. It works. It brings the capsicum element to the sauce. It makes sense. Now, sort of like the pros and the cons of like the internet. You can buy dried Ñora peppers really easily now. They're imported, and you can, with the click of a button, you can get them. So then it's like, well, should we still be defaulting to the red bell pepper if we have this option? Maybe, if you want to, but like also, it's not that hard to get the other one now. So it's cool to try it.
Wow, that's going right to like the top of my to-do list.
Yeah, you should. I'd be curious to. It definitely, you do it, and it's not wildly different sauce, but it's a different sauce. Like there's the pepper, it really shifts. That dried pepper really shifts. And what I found testing it, because I was like, okay, well now I've made it with the Ñora peppers and I have some sense of what that tastes like. What would I do if I can't get Ñora peppers? And what I found was actually like a dried ancho is a closer substitute than a roasted bell pepper.
That's really interesting. I mean, I have those in my pantry all the time.
Right. So then it's like, oh, there's actually something it can make it potentially a little hotter because some of the anchos have more heat. So it's, it's different, but it's like more, and you get more of those like chocolatey notes, those earthy, chocolatey, like dried pepper notes that you get from the Nyoda peppers that I think even roasting a bell pepper, you get the char, you get that complexity, but you don't get like that kind of chocolate earth, sweet, concentrated thing.
Interesting. And so many people also then we've moved from like charring fresh peppers to just buying jarred roasted red peppers, which like moves it even further away. Because I think when you buy a jarred roasted red pepper, they don't have that same smoky characteristic as like a fresh cooked one. So we keep like diluting it out over time.
Totally. Because when you roast it yourself and you rub the skins off, but there's little flecks that remain. Mm-hmm. And when you get the ones in the jar, they've pretty thoroughly cleaned that off. And I'm not interested in it in the sense of being like, this is the only way to do it. This is the right way. It's more just like, it's so cool to know that and experience it just so that the next time you choose whatever you want to do, but you have like a different perspective on it. I think that's what I like about it.
I have a quick question from a personal note. So Atole, like I'm really getting into these drinks, and I know you have a trio on your website, right?
Yeah.
And it calls for like using the maseca, but what if you wanted to use like a regular, like I get Macienda's masa. Would you use the same amount and cook it the same way? Does it just take a little longer? Like the difference between going from like a maseca to like a really good masa? Because I ordered the chaparrado mix from Macienda. So I'm assuming they're using their good masa, and it takes like 10 minutes to cook. Would you make any adjustments?
Does their mix also already have the chocolate in it? Like,
it does. So you buy it
ready to go mix? It's
fully ready to go. It's got the masa, it's got chocolate, it's got cinnamon, it's got dried chilies in there, and you just add, they say, milk or water or a combination, and it cooks up in about 10 minutes. And it's delicious, but it's not inexpensive. It's like $12, and you get like 4 to 6 portions out of it, and it's amazing. But I really was interested in. So I started looking for recipes to make it on the internet and found yours. And then I saw like the orange one. I'm like, wow, that sounds really good. But I have tons and tons of like really good masa in my pantry. I can't remember the last time I bought like maseca. So I was thinking, oh, well, clearly it can be made with good masa. So I didn't know about like cooking times and, swapping out the recipe, if you had any insight into that.
I wish I had more. Those are going back some years. So it's also my testing memory.
Yeah, it was like 2015 or something. I can't believe I had never seen it.
6 years. So I don't have a good answer. I mean, so I developed those, and like you said, I did them with the maseca, which I think is, pretty common, but also is like it's not the most spectacular masa product. And I think there are people who have some real critiques about the brand. Like you could sort of dive into. I don't feel equipped to represent any side in that debate, but definitely just looking at something like tortillas, like making tortillas from maseca is definitely a step up flavor wise from most of the packaged ones, the more mass market packaged ones anyway, if you're not buying some more specialty product. But there's whole levels of improvement above that with better masa harina product or a fresh masa. And I didn't test at the time with I didn't test like those variations. It's funny you bring it up because every once in a while, and particularly in the winter, I think probably within the past week, I probably had this thought where I've been like, God, I really should like make a champurrado, but like do it with like a fresh masa.
Well, I guess I'll just start testing it out. I just don't know what their ratios are of stuff in their mix. So I know like how many grams of their mix per ounces of water. Like I know for like 8 ounces of milk or water, this is how many grams I use. But of those grams, I don't know like what percentage is chocolate versus their masa. Yeah. So it might take, I guess I've got some time, maybe make it my own little test kitchen project and see. But maybe I'll use your recipe and you go by texture, right? Like you make a batch, and if it's, too thick, the next time up the level of, liquid or...
My experience with it is that it's the kind of thing that you really can make a lot of adjustments in the moment. Like you're not locked in to, if it's too thick, for example, you're not locked into that. Just thin it with more liquid. Like I think you can kind of, if you take a certain quantity of whatever you're using for the nixtamalized corn component and you thin it and it's cooking, it's simmering and it's too thick, I think you can just thin it more and thin it more. And you could even probably try to like kind of get that consistency in the zone. And maybe, with evaporation and as it's simmering, you might have to make little adjustments as you're playing with it. But then once you kind of get that where you want it, then you could play around with, now I'm going to start melting chocolate into it or incorporating the chocolate. And then once you kind of get like the chocolate level where you want it. And, I assume neither of us have a real lived experience with these drinks that would
Zero. Yeah. I've never had it outside of using this mix. So
the, what's chocolatey enough is, you and I have to kind of go by our, best judgment. And maybe somebody who's, from Mexico would taste it and say, yeah, you really pushed this chocolate too far. Like you got to taste the corn more. There might be some nuance that we're, missing, but I would just kind of play around with it, I think, and get the thickness where you want it by just slowly adding more liquid until it seems about right. Then get the chocolatiness where you want it, and then kind of, season it with the spices. I think you can kind of just dial that in.
This one was really good. And I think on their website, they said like someone who worked at Empellón developed the recipe. Like, I don't know if it was one of their pastry chefs or someone who worked at the bar even. So now that I've had what I think is probably like a good version of it, then I have in my mind's eye kind of like where I want it to be for texture and chocolate. Like it's less sweet than I think I was expecting it to be. So now it's like, okay, well, I'll try and achieve that.
Yeah, it's so helpful to have these data points. And obviously the more one accrues for any given thing in life, the more I think that kind of that picture gets filled in, and it becomes easier to also decide where on the sort of spectrum of possibilities we want our own version to exist. Anyone can make those decisions, in any moment, but like you're describing, the more versions you've tasted that other people make, the more you're like, okay, yeah, I have a kind of new, my impulse would have been to make this sweeter, but I actually really appreciate this version's dialed down sweetness. And I kind of get that now. Like I see why that's maybe a good move here. And so then that's going to change how you do it. And if you try more over time, like you get more and more. It's who should develop which recipes is obviously a really important question. And it's one that takes a lot of care because you want an informed developer behind any recipe that has a cultural heritage, but you also don't want to pigeonhole people where it's like, well, let's say I'm a New York Jew or half Jew, therefore like Daniel, you're the gefilte fish and kugel and bagels guy. Like I'm very happy to be the gefilte fish and kugel and bagels guy, but I don't want to only be that guy, and being careful not to channel individuals into just these things, but at the same time having knowledgeable people work on recipes. And so that's something, I generally try, deciding what's enough experience with something is I think a pretty complicated question and not an easy one. But I personally try not to develop recipes if I have no experience with something. Like just for me personally, like if you go in my archive, I'm sure, you will find exceptions to this because I've been working long enough that it's happened. But like mostly if I don't feel like I have that kind of context, the contextual sense at all, I definitely should not be the person doing it. And then deciding what's enough context is that's a lot harder. But, these are questions that are not easily answered, but need to be front of mind.
Yeah, you have a lot of great contributing people to the website, and it's good to see that you're leaning on their experiences to bring some of their recipes to the table.
Yeah, and that's something that we've, in the early days of Serious Eats, there were a lot more contributors, but there was also not much sort of quality control in place, and so the quality of those early recipes in the early years is kind of all over the map, and that's something that we're cleaning up actively now. And then, as I think the site matured and we said, well, we don't want to have recipes if we don't have a certain confidence level about their quality, we kind of pulled in and started working with fewer non-staff contributors. we just didn't have the resources to kind of do it right. And I'm really happy that that's changed now, and that we're pushing back in the direction of expanding the voices on the site and having the resources now to have all of those recipes, both by our staff and by the contributors, be more thoroughly vetted and put through a more, standardized process, and not just get published with, which in 2008, in the infancy of the site, like things got published that like, you look at and you're like, and we've removed a ton of that, and we're actively removing a lot more of that, just because it's, if the confidence isn't there, it shouldn't stay. But I am really feel good that we're finding ourselves in a place where this is changing in the direction of more voices, not fewer. And I think that's just obviously better in so many ways, and so good that we're able to kind of do it now. So,
well, thanks so much. I think we've had a great conversation. I don't want to hold you any longer. I'm probably going to break this into 2 episodes.
Cool. That's awesome. If I have a tendency to like digress and go on tangents. So, if on a re-listen, you're like, actually on second thought, this is a 1-hour episode. And as someone who works as an editor, there's no hard feelings if the cutting happens.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I thank you for inviting me on. It's just great to chat. I loved it.
Yeah, I'm glad we could catch up after all these years to have a, not quite in person, but a live conversation, right?
Yeah, let's not make it, let's do it again.
Sounds great. And to all our listeners, this has been Chris Spear with the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. As always, you can find us at chefswithoutrestaurants.com.org and on all social media platforms. Thanks so much and have a great week. Thanks for listening to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. And if you're interested in being a guest on the show or sponsoring a show, please let us know. We can be reached at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.